Before we say anything this week, we wanted to express our condolences to the people who lost someone on June 23rd. Michel Mizrahi was a grandfather who, rather than try to escape an active shooter, chose to guide others to safety first. He appears to have been mistakenly shot by the police. He was 68 years old. Mohamed Lamin Ben Radwan was a police officer whose wife is pregnant with their second child. He died confronting the shooter. He was 34. The shooter is also dead, and his family is grieving too. By now, we have a pretty good idea of what motivated this man to drive from Alberta to Montreal with a carbine rifle in tow. The shooter left behind a manifesto outlining his worldview, and it is a dog's breakfast. Here's the only consistent theme. He hates women. He views them not as people with human rights, but as a resource, being hoarded by more attractive men. He doesn't think it should be legal for women to work. He believes in enforced monogamy. His solution for being rejected by women is violence. The shooter did not pull these ideas out of thin air. Yes, these are the core tenets of incel extremism, but there are traces of it throughout our culture. With me to talk about this is Nora Loreto. Nora is a freelance journalist, author, and one of the best political thinkers in Canada. She's also frequently been the target of online harassment campaigns from the far right, including members of incel groups. Nora Loreto, welcome to the show. Nora Loreto, welcome to the show. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
So in your piece, you wrote a piece about this on Substack. It's brilliant. I encourage people to go to your Substack and read it. It seems as though the intended target might have been the CEO of Pornhub's parent company. And everybody who died on Monday was a man. And yet the shooter's worldview seems to be basically that he hates women. What were you able to glean from that 103-page manifesto?
Yeah. Honestly, when I was reading it, I was like, if only someone in this guy's life was able to have taken him under the wing. And maybe that's like a bit Pollyannish. Maybe that's like too soft because like this guy's a cold-blooded killer and he has this violent manifesto, which is true. But like this was someone that was trying to make sense of an economic system that has not worked in his favor, and of someone who had zero luck with women and blamed what he called the trauma of trying to get with women and failing every single time, the impact that has had on him personally. And so this is like 102 or whatever pages of trying to like reverse engineer some kind of theory to justify the extreme loneliness that he experienced, the economic injustices that he said that he experienced, and to explain why it was so traumatic for him to not be able to have relationships with women at all, it seems like. And I mean relationships in the whole kind of like a gam of way that one might have a relationship with another person. But what I think is so interesting is, you started this off by saying all of the victims in this were men. And yet here we have someone who is driven by a violent misogyny. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that violent misogyny, whatever, it harms men too. Feminist scholars have always said that misogyny and the way that misogyny is expressed within Western societies. Obviously, the body count is the highest for women because women are murdered in intimate relationships. They're murdered not in intimate relationships. I mean, a woman is murdered every other day.
90% of the victims of domestic intimate partner violence are women. And it's some it's how many feminicides have there been in Quebec this year? And it's
unquestionably that is the most important place to see the violence, but it impacts men in very profound ways as well. And you can look at the ways that it impacts men and everything from the world of grifters trying to make men look better, normatively better, feel better about themselves, work out to a point where they're like, fit and attractive. Like the ridiculous like body modification that we're seeing with like literally breaking bones in people's faces to look a certain way. All of this harms men, and the harms to men are perhaps different. But when you have a violent expression of this, that violence is going to be chaotic, and in a chaotic, violent situation, anybody can be killed. And in this case, it happened to be men only.
You were talking in your piece, you talk about this as being a kind of reaction to like the Andrew Tates of the world. As like you promised us if we did all these things, we would get women, but we've done it and it hasn't worked. Why even bother trying to improve ourselves? We need a violent revolution.
Yeah.
How is it? How is the sort of incel movement now, or what we saw the other day? How is that different than how it used to be?
Well, what it used to be was just do these things and it will work. And of course, it takes a little while to do these things and to realize that that's not actually going to be your salvation. And so, what was really interesting to me, not interesting in the French sense because it's not a positive interesting, but what's interesting to me was that there were pages and pages and pages of comments that he scraped from Reddit of people expressing similar frustrations with the world. And then he goes through many pages of different kinds of swindlers, he says. So the people like the Andrew Tates of the world, or the Jordan Petersons of the world, or the Charlie Kirks of the world, how they promised men, do these things and you will get the girl, feel better about yourself, be in shape, maybe get a good job, have economic security. And here, many years have passed since those messages first emerged in the manosphere. And this is a guy who would have been like a teenager, an early teenager when this stuff was really emerging. He's probably tried it all and none of it worked because it is all a grift. It is all lies. It sells men the idea that any negative thing that they're experiencing, whether or not those things are real or completely invented in someone's mind, they are the fault of women and they are the fault of immigrants and they are the fault of capitalism. And so what we get in this guy's manifesto is a real mash of all of those things. And he doesn't name anybody. He doesn't say that this is because of Jordan Peterson, blah, blah, blah. But Peterson's 10 rules for life, the guy becomes a millionaire promising men a 10-step self-help guide to make their lives better. That's not how social change works. And this guy's a good expression of what happens when you believe that this stuff could work. But, actually, no, he's transcended that and realized that maybe the real problem is capitalism, which is where then you get this really wacky mix of ideologies and manifestos and beliefs and stuff all together through a probably ChatGPT aided manifesto that was, it's mostly junk and not worth reading. So I read it for you.
Yeah, no, seriously, it is heavy work because there's a lot of self pity in there. It does go on and on. There's the writing is like way overly academic. Um, we met because of incels and because of violent
Yeah.
misogyny. Our first conversation was about you being doxxed and you being targeted by the far right. A lot of people have called this guy a Marxist, anti-Zionist. They've tried to label him in all kinds of different ways, but it really seems like the only consistent thread through his screed is a hatred of women. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be the kind of rigid thinking that you see in fascism. Like there is
Mm-hmm.
an order to things. I want to be in a certain place in the order. I can't be there, therefore I must do these violent things. What like back then, and again, this is how we met. We were investigating a neo-Nazi cell in Montreal, and there was a lot of overlap between members of this cell and incels. A lot of these
Yeah.
guys, like the way they got into the incel movement was they were playing video games, and then there was this Gamergate thing, and it's like women are destroying the video game industry, and then it's women are bad, and then that once you've dehumanized women, then it makes it kind of easier to like rope more and more and more people into this ideology. How do you think how are all these columnists who are kind of avoiding the incel thing? How do you think they're getting the shooter wrong?
Yeah, I think first of all, like to say that this guy has any kind of coherent ideology is nuts. I mean, it's just, anyone who has a proper coherent ideology is not driving all across Canada to shoot from a hotel window into an office window, hoping maybe allegedly to kill the CEO of that company. Right? Like that's the most important thing. Like it's that is not coherent. He is someone who because he fashions himself an intellectual is reaching to many intellectual texts, and some of the texts that he cites are actual AI hallucinations, so that's also important to note. But he's trying to draw on economic theory to explain why things are as bad as they are. And so if you try to say, oh, this guy only hates women, let's say, you're missing a whole chunk of what he's saying. If you try to say that he hates Zionists, for example, I mean, you're completely missing the point of what he says. And this guy actually in a footnote teases out the fact that he thinks it's wrong to say that all Jews are Zionists, and he thinks it's wrong to say that Jews are controlling the elites, and actually that there's many Jewish thinkers and activists that have been very important to challenge the elites. So that is like just totally wrong. If you read the manifesto, you can see for yourself, and we're talking a tiny footnote of 102 pages. If you say that he's anti-capitalist, that might be right to an extent, but capitalism is the current system that we all live under. So people being critical of capitalism is like not a surprise. And that's actually like the status quo. The vast majority of people are critical of capitalism because it has created the affordability crisis. It has created, a lot of misery, and people can't have good jobs and all that kind of stuff. What I think is really necessary, if you want to think about this like an adult, and let's be clear, most of the columnists that get it wrong are the ones that don't want to think about this like an adult. So, let's ignore them. But if you want to think about this as an adult, the way that you started talking about this just now, saying that this seems like fascism, I think is a really important entry point. Because fascism, fascism as we understand it today is not exactly how fascism emerged in the 1920s and 30s. And actually the way that it emerges in the 1930s allows us to see why someone like this would have this mismatch of ideology and still come up as not being a Marxist, for example, right? Because this guy is not a Marxist. It is not Marxist to say that we should have state-owned telecommunications and a planned economy, but women need to be at home and in the kitchen and not working. That's not Marxism. There's no thread of Marxism.
Specifically, like says that like the unpaid women, like capitalism relies on the unpaid labor of women.
This is Engel's big contribution to Marxism. And actually, there's a really great book, I forget the author, about the Marx women, the women who are around Marx, his wife and his daughters, and how they helped to elucidate these kinds of ideas within Marxism, right? So if we're going to be adults about it, why is this actually a fascist way to look at these things? Here's the history lesson or the political science lesson or whatever. Marxism understands society as a series of class relationships. There is the dominated and the dominators. There is the working class or the proletariat, and the ownership class or the bourgeoisie, right? And I mean, it's not actually as simple as that, but we're going to do this in 5 minutes. And so if society is a constant struggle of class relationship between people who do not have and people who do have, the exploited and the exploiters, then you need to have some sort of system that manages that, right? Because otherwise you're just always in conflict. And so a Marxist would look at this and say, well, the only way to have a system that manages class conflict is to give more power to the exploited and take power away from the dominating. That makes a lot of sense, right? You remove power from the people to exploit. You invest power in average people to actually control their own affairs, control their own state, plan their economy, and you can have justice served in that way. Fascists will look at the same class dynamics and say, well, we need to do something that mitigates that class conflict, but that does not empower the working class. And there's a lot of different ways that you can imagine doing this. There's theorists in the 1930s who were sympathetic to Marxism, but then believed fascism was going to get past those class divisions by appealing to things like nationalism, or appealing to things like blaming a minority on why the problems exist that exist, while empowering the elites to have even more power to run things as efficiently as possible. And in a system like that, you have the working class people focused on immigration, on Jews, on communists, while the elites actually run the economy and exploit the working class without having too much conflict in that, because people are busy. They're looking at something else. Their pride in the nation means that, well, I might be exploited, but it's all for the greater good of actually having our nation have trains that run on time or a strong economy. So this is actually the basis of fascist thought and of fascist ideology, that we just need an efficient system to transcend the problems that we are experiencing. Now, this guy's manifesto does not make these points. He's not this sophisticated. He sees the problem as being a degeneration of the natural order of biology, and in that degeneration, which is accelerated by capitalism, we are all unhappier. And so what the natural state is, me as a woman, I just need one man to procreate with. We'll have children, we'll have a family unit, and this will be fine. Multiply that across society, and people are happy all of a sudden, right? Of course, that's not how this works at all. But this is what he believes is going to mitigate class conflict, is the biological determinants of, well, a man can have 1 million children and we need to stop that from happening. We need to actually force people to be in couples. And that provides the stability that the state requires to then do things in his manifesto, like nationalize the transportation system.
The it's interesting that you bring up like this monogamy thing, right? Enforced monogamy. That's something that Jordan Peterson has spoken favorably of. I think one of the things that scares me is that there have been so many men and political thinkers, some of them are women, who they play with this anger. This like there is like a seething male anger across our society, isolation, as you correctly point out. And it feels like a lot of people in our political system think they can control this, or think they can kind of ride this wave of anger right to the point of danger.
Yeah.
It won't be so bad. We'll get in power. We'll be able to control it. What are some examples you think right now, politically in Quebec and Canada, of political thinkers who are kind of playing with this?
Oh, all of the political parties are. All of the political parties are. I mean, the NDP less, Quebec Solidaire less. They're influenced by it, I would say, more than actually driving that line. But the Liberals and the Conservatives are just kind of like, they're circling around that anger. And the way that it expresses itself is different with the two parties, but the two parties they're both doing it. So with Pierre Poilievre, it's this appeal to a past that's never existed. It's this demonization of immigration for being the reason why someone can't get a house or a job, that kind of thing. And then the Liberals will play off of that and say, oh no, but the Conservatives are lying. There's no problem. And that push-pull is actually like, that it's that whole process that's really, really damaging for people, because like we know the statistics that social conditions are declining, our social services are in decay, families are being delayed because no one can afford to have children, even if you want to have children, even if you have that perfect monogamous 2-person relationship. Statistically speaking, people are not having children because they have nowhere to live with the children. They bought a condo when they were 27 on the promise of owning property, and that condo like doesn't have a room for a child, right? Like really basic stuff. And that with let's say like a comfortable majority probably of people in that situation where they're not checking out of society, writing violent manifestos, driving across Canada to kill people. People are just sucking it up, keeping their nose to the grindstone and making it work. All of us know people in that situation, right? Then you move into other worlds where it's like people staying in relationships for too long because there's nowhere for people to move out to. They can't afford to divorce. They can't afford to remortgage their homes. And so all of this stuff is tied to economic conditions, which I think is what scares a lot of the columnists who are trying to spin this in a different way. The manifesto is correct in identifying that the social and economic conditions that have been created by capitalism are destroying people. That is true. That is totally 100% true. The solutions is where the guy goes way off the rails. And then, of course, bringing in the whole incel aspect is also way off of the rails. But we live in a moment in Canada where things have never been so unequal. There's never been so much wealth, and wealth has never been so concentrated, and there has never been so much poverty in the history of this country. And so when you put all of that into society, you create a pressure cooker. And when you create a pressure cooker like that, add to it ChatGPT and hallucinated AI and extreme loneliness and feeling like you've been traumatized by the fact that you can't get a girlfriend. Whereas maybe the women in your lives are experiencing the exact same kinds of loneliness and the exact same kinds of trauma, but it's expressed completely differently. I mean, this is the soup that we're all swimming in that's so dangerous. And I think that there's an element in the mainstream that has to do everything possible to not name this, or else the liberal and conservative dance around what this issue is becomes more obviously dangerous to more people.
Nora, I really appreciate you coming on, and I really appreciate you adding nuance and so much thoughtfulness to this conversation. I hope we get to talk to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Anytime.